All right. Well, my name is Sarah Ring. I'm continuing education librarian at Minitex, and I'll be your main moderator for today. And I'm joined by my colleague Kyle Triska, who's the resource sharing specialist at Minitex and supports MinLink, which is our Minnesota statewide discovery and interlibrary loan interface. So he'll be helping me out as needed. And our presenter today is Theresa Berger. She is Digital Library Services Librarian and Head of Digital Library Services, the unit within the larger unit cataloging metadata and digitization services at the University of Minnesota Libraries. So as Head of Digital Library Services, Theresa helps lead the library's efforts to develop, grow, and sustain a complement of digital library services. And that includes digital conversion, digital collection development, and metadata management applications in support of researchers' needs. So welcome, Theresa. I'm going to stop sharing here. And if you could go ahead and bring up your slides for us.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. I love the jargon with my job description. There's a lot going on
Yeah,
with that.
I stumbled a little bit over that.
No, you did not. I stumbled with it myself. Okay, let me see if I can share here. I'm juggling a couple of monitors. Okay. Is that working for everybody?
Looks great. I see your full screen.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Okay. All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks again for being here. And thank you, Sarah and Minitex, for inviting me. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Theresa Berger, and I am the head of digital library services at University of Minnesota, where I oversee digitization and digital collections development. That's kind of my summary of that really long jargon there for archives and special collections. So not with me today, though, but a huge part of this project is Jackson Myers. He's a rising senior and stats major at the U, and his contributions to this project have been phenomenal since day one. So I just want to give him a little bit of a shout out there. Oops, trying to change slides. There we go. Okay. So I'm here today to share a little bit about a project that I've been working on related to using ChatGPT to create alt text specifically for archival images. First, though, I thought I'd share a little bit about our collections and the project goals. Then I'll describe our workflow and discuss some of the technical considerations that we've put into the project, as well as go through several examples of AI-generated alt text and some of the pros and cons that we've encountered with these tools. And then I'll close this out with some general observations that have come from the project and perhaps some things to consider if you're thinking about building out a workflow or implementing your own project using AI. Regardless of the specifics, regardless of whether or not you're using really old photographs as your subject matter. So we have over 130,000 still images on our open access digital collection site, UMedia. These represent material from collections across the Twin Cities, as well as other UMN campuses like Duluth and Crookston. And the main goal of this project was to assess whether or not we could use a generative AI model like ChatGPT to generate alt text for these images without having to do any sort of intense modeling or training. And while ADA Title II has certainly been on our minds, as I think it might be on many of yours, I'd say the main goals were more around promoting accessibility and discoverability of materials in a general sense. We really wanted to focus on this as a tools evaluation and consider the limited staffing and technical expertise that we have with us. I'm a one-man unit. I have 2 other employees with me, and then we work with a lot of students. So it was really important to make sure that this could be replicated and sort of rolled out as efficiently and painlessly as possible. And I think this really underscores a point that I've seen emerging when it comes to introducing AI to libraries and within cultural heritage, in that the focus is not necessarily on trying to assist with work that we do on our daily basis, but really more to help replace things or help fill in gaps that we might not otherwise have time or resources to do. So really, it was just more of a tools evaluation. What can this help with? What kind of gaps could it fill? So with that in mind, and after completing a very quick proof of concept, I secured funding from our Dean of Libraries to launch a pilot using GPT-4 to generate alt text for all of the images in UMedia. This included funding to hire Jackson, and then as well as funding to set up a university-supported instance of Microsoft Azure. Going through Azure has been one of the keys to this project's success. What Azure does, and there are other tools like Azure out there, other platforms, I should say, this gives us an access to a closed ChatGPT model, and this allows us to input images from Umedia, ask the tool to generate the alt text, but all while ensuring that the data, in this case the images, is not being put out into the world for any sort of questionable reuse or training, right? Everything kind of stays with us, stays within this system. You can see more about the privacy policy on the slide here. This was super important when considering issues around copyright, unknown creators and provenance, and even subject matter, which are all really important when it comes to working with visual collections. So key point, if you're ever going to do any sort of workflow with this, really research where the data is going, what's being reused, what's being used to train things. Can you get around that and use something like an Azure closed model? With Jackson's help, we now have an image input script that relies on making batch API calls between image URLs on Umedia and this closed model, almost to the point where it's running in the background. I just kind of push a button and it does a lot of the work for me. Together, we've reviewed AI-generated alt text describing close to 3,000 images, and some very clear patterns about what these models are good at and what they maybe struggle with have definitely been emerging. Before I get into the results, though, I want to talk about our approach to alt text. For those who may not know, alt text is a very brief, sometimes literal description of an image or a graphic meant to assist those using a screen reader or assist with other accessibility considerations. It's not the same as archival description or even the metadata you might see in a catalog record. It's also important to note that most guidelines for creating alt text are written with a general website in mind. Aside from a document from Cooper Hewitt at the Smithsonian for creating alt text for art collections, there really aren't specific guidelines for doing this in cultural heritage environments. I think that's problematic for a few reasons that I'll get into later, but for now, this meant that the prompt you see on the slides and our process for analysis emerged from sort of a combination of surveying those general guidelines and general websites, as well as emerging research on AI prompting, which I would say isn't so much a science as it is an art. I won't read the prompt, but I encourage you to take a look at what we settled on. There's what I've seen referred to as listing techniques here, so that's why we have those numbered points, as well as giving the AI an out to help prevent it from guessing. I don't know if that's really been all that effective, but it's something we wanted to try and something we wanted to include here. So, as I've said, we've reviewed over 3,000 images and have definitely been able to draw some key conclusions about what the tool is good at and not so good at. The first thing that we discovered is that it's generally pretty good at dealing with images of nature, landscape, plants, agriculture even, and that this was varying across formats and date ranges. Here on this slide, I've got digital images, 35mm slides, and even a woodcut print from 1576. And all of the outputs were, I think, totally acceptable. I think this last one here is really interesting to me. The AI gave me page with Latin text and illustration of a pea plant with pods and leaves. Text surrounds the plant drawing. I don't think I could have come up with anything better. I was really impressed that it recognized the Latin, that it got kind of the details on the illustration. So that was really exciting for us. Another positive output was the ability to describe buildings and physical spaces. This has been great for our institutional and university archives, for example, which feature a lot of photos of buildings across campus over time. We also found that it was pretty good with group photos and describing activity. I'll talk about describing actual individuals in a photo in a little bit, but in general, large groups like this football team photo and even describing overall actions like dancing or playing an instrument were pretty successful. Give you a chance to read that and look at that one. Moving on to what the AI was bad at, though, because plenty of that. One place has been with counting. So because of the way these tools divide an image into different quadrants or segments, it can sometimes misinterpret quantities and has a hard time balancing numerical logic. I think this is probably improving with new releases. Remember, we were using ChatGPT 4.0. There's now a 5.0. But we had several instances where it claims that there's a certain number of people or objects in a photo, and it's just plain wrong. I might suggest that many of these numerical errors could arguably be fixed from a workflow perspective by simply removing the number. So for example, in this last photo, you could say a large group of people instead of 25 people, where there clearly is not 25 people there. But still, counting errors were something we saw throughout the review, and this resulted in an automatic failure in the rating system that we developed. We also saw hallucinations, though I'd point out maybe not as many as you might expect. You can see here that it's mistaken a child's doll for a person and included it as one of the women sitting in the front row. Perhaps even more concerning, though, was using the word traditional to describe non-Western contexts. This is something we found early on in testing, and we tried to avoid by explicitly writing into the prompt a few slides ago to not use words like traditional. But still, we saw it, going back to that idea of prompting being an art and not really a science. Sometimes it's going to ignore what you say. Obviously, using words like this, especially with the varied images that we have in our collection, was really problematic, and it was another automatic fail in our rating system. The largest error that we saw, though, and I thought this was really interesting, was poor transcription. I know there's a lot coming out about AI being able to help with transcription in collections, but that wasn't the case for us with such a large and varied data set. If you think about the variety of typescripts and handwriting and other text considerations across a collection the size of ours, and the fact that we weren't doing any sort of training, I think this makes sense. So in our prompt, we specifically gave the tool an out and told it to, quote, summarize text that cannot be transcribed. Unfortunately, though, perhaps the biggest downfall of AI is that it is overly confident. This meant it would attempt to transcribe material no matter what, even when it made no sense. Working through so many images and seeing so many examples of transcription in photos, though, I think has made me realize that maybe we need to better articulate what we mean by transcription being a requirement in alt text. So do we need transcription of wordings on posters or other metadata elements written on the back of the photograph, like a person's name? Absolutely. But do we need every single label of this architectural drawing that I have here on the slide and every single bit of scribbles on the back of that photograph included? I don't think so. I would say both of these examples actually could be turned into acceptable alt text pretty quickly by eliminating the AI's attempts to transcribe. So if you get rid of the output, some of the junk on this second photograph here, and you simply change it to back of photograph with handwritten notes and art studio stamps, just kind of truncate it, I think that's perfectly acceptable. For this reason, we chose to pass outputs that provided correct summaries of what we deemed non-essential text. And then, of course, if the tool attempted to transcribe and got it wrong, we failed it. We also tried to improve our outputs by doing a bit of low-level tinkering. Again, we didn't want to do things that required a lot of training or resources. And so the first thing we did was try to slightly adjust the prompt by adding signal words based on the specific collection that a set of images came from. So for example, we changed, you are an expert creating objective alt text for a university's digital image archive to, you are an expert creating objective alt text for a university's digital image archive of farming and nature images. We kind of added that little descriptor at the end. We did the same thing with African American histories and related materials. We told it that it was specifically going to receive architectural drawings and design plans. I think while we thought this was a really good idea at first, the numbers actually show that these prompt changes made no significant difference in the pass or fail ratings. This means that a clear, well-written general prompt is the best recommendation from a larger workflow perspective. The other thing that we tested was whether or not the inclusion of metadata made a difference. Here, I think the number results are a bit tricky. So I'd argue that qualitative assessment might be a bit more important in this case. So on the one hand, we saw that AI was dumping proper nouns and years into the alt text and favoring the metadata we were giving it over actual visual description, which you see here with the inclusion of, quote, Duluth's aerial bridge and adding the year 1904. None of that is super important from an alt text perspective. It's really important to the photograph, but that would be description and not alt text. On the other hand, we saw improvement of the AI recognizing stage scenes and identifying people as actors or performers when we told it that it was being given images from a theater collection. We also saw less of that really bad use of the word traditional when a geographic location was included. And these observations were true for both item and folder level description. If you work with archival materials, that's a really important thing when working with visual collections. So at this point, I'd say whether or not you include metadata in your input could maybe be a budgetary consideration, but perhaps a good thing if you have the funds and the time to clean up those bad outputs. Last but most certainly not least, I want to talk about the identification of people in this work and also the identification of people when it comes to alt text in general. So just as best practices say to transcribe what is in the photo and don't consider key context of archival collections, I would suggest that the guidelines also oversimplify best practices when it comes to describing people. These guidelines say to ask each individual their racial and gender preferences, or better yet, give them the opportunity to describe themselves. They say to include skin color and gender. I think this should 100% be an end goal in our work, but we also need to acknowledge that this is complicated when it comes to archives. Obviously, we don't always have the ability to ask a person about their identity or preferences when we're working with collections and materials that are, in some cases, decades, even centuries old. In addition, and in the context of our specific case, because we are doing everything within that Azure environment that I mentioned, the tool has a built-in function that automatically applies face blurring as a pre-processing step. This means that any faces detected in the image are blurred before the image is passed to the model for analysis. We saw this time and again where the alt text would do a decent job in describing the clothing and other details of a portrait, and then end with face blurred, as I have in this example. At first, I was pretty defeated by this, but the more I sat with the implications, the better I felt. If this is what it means to be more ethical and responsible in our use of AI, to know that our collections are not being used to create unintended bias in the tool. Think, for example, the amount of portraits of white men in a university archive compared to photos of women or people of color in that collection over time, then so be it. This means that there is a place where human generation and not just review of the alt text needs to happen as part of our workflow. Additionally, I think it would be a mistake to not call out the fact that describing images of people in our collections is tricky and it requires a lot of thought and consideration, regardless of whether or not AI is involved. So the AI did use clothing as cues to assume a person's gender, which I think is problematic and always worth reviewing. At the same time, though, I want to point out that there are situations in which the person doing the review can be just as faulty as the AI. If you take these two examples, in both cases, an actual human familiar with alt text either misgendered or misidentified the race of the person pictured, despite best intentions. I don't bring this up to defend AI in any way, but to acknowledge that sometimes our discussions around whether or not AI should be used need to actually go beyond the AI debate itself. So this discussion of how to generate alt text for people in archival collections speaks to a larger issue surrounding archival description of visual resources in general. Not putting time and effort into physical identification can lead to misrepresentation and unintentional erasure in our collections. I think not only does this further enforce the idea that human review, again, is central to our workflow when implementing AI, but also that in the case of this project, I think I realized we need better guidelines and best practices for how we write alt text in our collections, especially when the information we need is not readily available. Okay, so what does this all mean? I've thrown a lot of information at you. After a number of simulations and cross-checks, we've determined that the chances of our instance of ChatGPT in Azure producing passable alt text for images in new media is 75% or greater. While a C average may not seem all that great, if you think about scale, I think it's a pretty big win. This means for the close to 135,000 images I have on UMedia, I can expect over 100,000 of them to be correct or very nearly close to correct by turning to ChatGPT and turning to this workflow. This is huge for me, given the fact that I have no support to do this otherwise. We've also been running simulations in cost. So by using the batch API function and that input script I mentioned, we've actually spent less than $20 in tokens, if you're familiar with how that works in these AI environments. And our projected cost for running this on all 134,000 images on UMedia is less than $200. This is clearly a lot of bang for our buck. It means more money, more resources, and more time to devote to the review portion and that cleanup portion, including perhaps more research on who we're describing. The next steps of this project include publishing these results and also working with our developers to implement the AI-generated alt text onto UMedia, while also figuring out a way to disclose to our users that AI was involved. I think transparency has to be a key goal in any of this type of work. And so overall, I'd say this project has absolutely been a success. However, I think I want to end us with some larger observations and takeaway that hopefully apply to any workflow or any project using AI, regardless of the specific details. Number one, 100% human review is key. For all the cost and the time savings in that last slide, this last slide, these tools are not foolproof, and the final result of the work depends on our expertise and our knowledge in order to be implemented successfully. I will not put any of these out there online for people to draw from until I've had a chance to review them and I feel comfortable with what I have. Number two, this has been sort of a happy accident that has emerged from this project, and I've also seen becoming part of other projects like ours. Introducing AI can actually help us identify spaces where we need to do better and be better, and may actually reveal new angles and ideas for new projects. So again, in our case, I fully believe after working on this project that we need a set of best practices and requirements for writing alt text in archival collections, one that speaks to the nuances of our materials. Going back to that use of the word traditional, we know that use of the word is not what we want for certain images, but I also admit that I may not be the best person to describe that image. So I also think another thing that's emerging is that I need to collaborate more with other stakeholders. And so I encourage you to be open to the possibility that introducing AI can lead to instances where you need to find yourself working more, maybe working a little bit harder than you originally thought. And three, finally, I think what we've seen here is that just like so many other things we use on a regular basis, AI is just another tool. When used responsibly, keyword underscore responsibly, I would argue that it allows us to shift, not replace resources in a way that can better serve our stakeholders, our users, and our communities. And with that, thank you again for having me, and I'd love to take any questions anybody has.
Thank you, Theresa. That was great. So now is the time, if you have some questions, please go ahead and submit them via the chat. Or if you want to use the raise hand icon, I'll see you and call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. I will pull it up as well. And while we're kind of waiting for people to submit some questions, I have one for you, Theresa. I was just curious, you may not have figured this part out yet, but how will you get the alt text back into the system, into UMedia? How's that part going to work?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Sarah. We're still kind of working through that part of it. I think in our case, we'll definitely rely on some kind of batch inputting scripts. So if anybody's not familiar with how alt text gets added to a website, there's kind of there's an HTML process involved with tagging images specifically, so that if you have a screen reader, you can kind of click over the image and it'll read the alt text to you. There's a little bit of an automated process involved there, and so I'll be working with our web developers to help with that. But one of the things I've been thinking about specifically is this fact that a lot of our images aren't necessarily described at an item level. And so this alt text workflow is kind of helping give a little bit of that item level description. It's not going to be super detailed, but at least it's something. And so what I want to do is maybe create a field in our content management system that actually would be public facing. And so it'd be a public facing field called alt text. You'd still have the alt text where it needs to be tagged with the image to be accessible, but also it might be a little bit of a description enhancement. So I think everybody could benefit from that. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about, maybe a new metadata field.
Thanks for that. And yeah. Oh, thanks, Kara, or it might be Kara, my apologies. But go ahead and unmute if you have a question.
Hi, it's Cara. Sorry, I was 10 minutes late to this, but this has been great what I've seen. I have a question, if you didn't mention this at the beginning. Do you have any disclaimers or any notes in your public interface that say that you've used AI to create metadata? Or because you're reviewing everything, you haven't really bothered to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When we roll this out, because I haven't put it up quite yet, I haven't run it through all of the images just yet. We will add that AI was used both in that alt text attribute. So if you again are using a screen reader, it's going to read that and tell you that AI and human review were involved, and then give you the alt text. And then I'm also going to put it up as kind of like maybe a banner or as part of our about page on the website as well. I think the transparency is so important here. Especially with the idea that these models, I think they're constantly evolving. So I think I'm going to also specifically say that ChatGPT 4.0 was used, because by the time we get there, I mean, we could be at 6.0, 7.0. So I think that's really key there.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got a question, and maybe you did cover this. Are you just giving the images, or are you giving any other metadata along with your prompt?
Yeah, so that's what we tested kind of a little bit with the metadata. We did try testing that, and we landed on this, it depends if it's useful or not. I am leaning towards just giving it the prompt, because that's less in tokens and it's like a little more cost savings, and I think it would actually generate faster the less information I give it. Yeah, so I wanted to land on this. Oh yeah, if you give it metadata, it's great and it's gonna be perfect. But it's not. I think it has a tendency to maybe overwhelm them, especially with the fact that we're not doing any training. And I should also say that metadata in visual collections, a lot of times I only have folder level metadata. I don't have anything about the individual photographs that are in that folder. And so it was also kind of like, oh gosh, is this even going to be helpful when I'm doing this at that individual item level? And I think that's where we kind of landed on not really.
I saw someone raise their hand. Was that you, Katie, that had a question?
Yeah. Thanks for this. This is really great to watch and see what you've done. I played around with this a little bit with my own institutions, like closed. It was like Microsoft Copilot for a very small group of illustrations. And I was wondering if you found, like, within those groupings of, let's say, like the landscape, after it had seen a certain amount, was it kind of training itself from that, or like did it keep anything, like it did retain any of those images, I guess, or learn from that, or not really?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We were curious about that. And in our case, it didn't, which I think was good, because the tool promises us that it's not using what we give it to do any kind of training or any sort of knowledge development, so to speak.
Right.
So that kind of actually was the good thing of like, okay, yeah, it's doing what it says it's doing. But it's a fair point. You know, if you had a collection where you could use it in an open environment, you felt comfortable putting in the data, would it get better? That's something to try.
Thanks.
Could
Okay,
you put your metadata back in the same stuff like right after you've gotten the results and say that didn't work so well? Could you try this? Would it change then with the same set of data or images?
Think it depends on how your model is set up. But if you are doing it in real time and like going back and forth, yes, I think if you gave it and you did it one by one, I think it would take in the metadata as like a follow-up to your prompt. Yes. In our case, though, I will say we were using this batch API script. And so the idea was to just have it go through a loop. And that's why we didn't really bother to see how much of the metadata had the impact in that.
I thought I saw Heidi raise her hand. Heidi, did you have a question?
Yes, this goes back to, I think, your question that you had more about just what policies do we need for ourselves first. And that's one thing, like I know when I was putting photographs into, back then it was called Minnesota Reflections, but the Minnesota Historical Society, and even like, I always am wondering about this balance. Like, is it important to make sure without a shadow of a doubt that you're putting in something that's accurate, but then does that leave it so generic that it's not helpful? Or do you try to at least believe what you're putting in there is accurate enough? So again, just thoughts on what you think that balance might be. Like, for example, I put in something like, female student, but I'm like, well, that's a female presenting, and I'm assuming they're a student, but maybe they're just a visitor happening to be at my college and are in front of Tower Hall. Like, I'm in Duluth at Scholastica, but like, I just always struggle with that. Like, where is the helpfulness versus the accuracy? And I think that's something that for us to sort as humans first before we even try to attempt to have AI figure and grapple with that idea. So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've like driven myself crazy in loops thinking exactly about that. And back to this point of like, there's no good guidelines on it if you're thinking about this from the cultural heritage perspective and the fact that these, are there's a time gap between when they were created and when we're working with them. Um, for me, what I've sort of landed on is the context of the collection. And so if this is the University Archives photographic collection, I'm pretty certain that the image of who I think is a professor is probably going to be a white man. And I will put that in there. And also, but I've been wanting to confirm with all of our curators because maybe they have a little more knowledge than I do. So that's sort of to that point of like, who else can we collaborate with? And knowing that that's going to take time to do that and to do it right and building in space for that. Um, and then I've also been, though, at the same time talking with, for example, we have the Treader LGBTQ archives in our collection, and I do a lot of work there with them. So I've been talking with the curator, Aidan Bettine, of, how do you want to describe the images in this collection? What is the right way to do this? And he's been recommending that we either, and this is again to that point of no best practices currently, not talk about gender and race and color in these photos and just kind of be a person standing in front of building in order to not get it wrong, in order to not inadvertently make mistakes that we don't want to make. So I think the context is really important in this side of it. Yeah. That's all that to say is I'd love to hear other people's thoughts and what else you think we should do, because I don't think there's a clear-cut answer here.
Other questions or comments for Theresa? Well, Theresa, if you want to stop sharing so I can bring up one more thing here.
Oh, I'll say one more thing, Sarah. This just came to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Spinning it kind of what Heidi just asked. I have a colleague, Dorothy Berry, she's, a well-known digital collections practitioner, and she's at the Smithsonian African American History Museum. And she has been working on a really large collection where she is handwriting alt text. She's not using AI, anything like that. But what's been really interesting is that we have both landed on the same conclusion that we need best practices in archives to do this, because she's struggling with those same questions where she's trying to research who's in this photograph, how do I best describe them and identify them, especially because a lot of the people in her collection are biracial. And so it is kind of an interesting point that we both sort of started from opposite ends and ended in the same space and place.
Someone just came to the chat. I just hope we don't make descriptions or alt text too generic that it can't be findable in the future. We don't want to get it wrong, but we also don't want to make them lost.
I think that's so true, Stephanie. And I think that's where I would sort of say, there's a place for what we're saying in our alt text and then a space for what we're saying in the archival description. And maybe we need to lean more into the archival description side of it if we decide to be generic in the photographs. Yeah, I think those delineations are really important.
All right, last call for questions or comments. All right, we have one here. I use Content DM software to create metadata and digitize our photo collections. My question is, can I add AI alt text to the digital images that have already been uploaded to the Content DM website?
I don't know, Alex. We use Content DM actually as well, and that's what I was thinking about when I said I might create a new field. But in our case, the public-facing website is actually homegrown and managed separately. So it's not the built-in website that comes with Content DM. I would say this, though, for anybody that does use Content DM, I know that they're coming out with a new instance of it. And I think that this is a really important space that we should be talking with the vendors about and the developers about, of like saying, hey, what are you doing for this? And to sort of promote accessibility with the collections. So If anybody reaches out to them and has the answer to that, I'd be really curious.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, now I'll make my final call for questions.
I have another.
Sure.
Theresa, have you like reached out or talked to anyone who's doing similar projects to you? This is the second project I've heard about using AI for alt text, so I was just wondering.
Yeah, the person that comes to my mind is I'm blanking on her last name, Sonia at Rutgers. I don't know if that's who you were thinking about. Yeah, and so we've talked a little bit about that and others in the DLF communities who I'm thinking of specifically.
Okay.
And it's really funny. I mean, we all land on the same, how do you describe people and race and these physical characteristics, you know, regardless of the tool and how you're using it. So I think there's if anybody's interested in starting a committee, task force, subgroup, whatever we wanted to call it these days, to work on this, please reach out, because I think there's a really big opportunity here.
Yeah, I went to a symposium and Peter Broadwell from Stanford was talking about his various projects. He's in AI modeling, and the alt text was one of them. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting use for AI.
All right. Well, seeing no other questions coming through or hands raised, just scanning one last time, I think we can wrap up for the hour, and I'll just say another thank you to Theresa for a great presentation. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So one last thing, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little feedback, if we end up doing the series again next year, the topics will come from you. So please give us your feedback and let us know if this was useful and what you'd like to see in the future. And also, quick housekeeping, I will be sharing the recording as soon as I can, and also a copy of Theresa's slides. So look for one more email from me. And we'll see some of you at the next, I do have one more slide. We might see some of you at the next one on November 20th. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.